The Human Perspective, Chapter 2, Adam and Eve. The second chapter of Genesis starts with the creation of the first human concept in the book, the week. In the first chapter, all creations refer to the world's objective existence. When addressing time in Genesis 1:14, let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. The text refers to stars and physical movements of the universe. The week is a human-made concept that does not come from any natural necessity or objective world observation. By doing so, the book separates the two stories and turns our attention to the subjective aspect of the human experience. In Chapter 2, the story of creation is repeated differently, as if it asks us to build a different aspect of the universe for the story's sake. The story starts with describing a perfect, naive, and safe world created by God, a world in which no responsibility, danger, or knowledge is required. Such a world can be easily understood as the environment any parents create for their children in their first years of existence. Parents often try and succeed in creating as much of a safe and risk-free environment in the early development stages of their newborn. Any person that has become a parent can relate to this idea. It is an instinct we all have, a wish we cherish, a fence we build around our child for as long as we can, allowing him to live and grow in the safety of our homes. The nativity that each child has can be described as a lack of knowledge as regards a general understanding of the cruelty, dangers, and requirement of the world. Knowledge can be interpreted in several ways: the knowledge of life, oneself, and the world around you. The Bible refers to a specific kind of knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil. While in the English version of the book the word evil is used, the Hebrew version uses the word bad. This difference is essential, as evil refers to an intentional act, while bad refers to an outcome. Our interpretation of the story will take the Hebrew word as bad engulfing evil. Good and bad can be seen as relative concepts connected to each other or as separate acts. In the first chapter of Genesis, the creation of God has been observed as good. This kind of good does not require any comparison, as it is by itself positive. It is easier to understand this concept by thinking about a day-to-day experience such as food. When tasting a new kind of food, a person can automatically recognize if it is good or not, regardless of any previous experience or comparison. The measurement of good, in this case, is based on the positive feedback we get from our senses when tasting the food in question. This idea can also be observed in the case of a bad experience. For example, the sensation of touching fire is bad for the body. This definition is not a compared experience, but an observation that stands by itself. Based on this logic, we can conclude that the idea presented in the story of Adam and Eve refers to a comparative bad and good. Any parent will know that he wishes to fend his kid off the bad in the world. He wants to protect his kids from the world's cruelty, responsibility, and pain for as long as possible. Some do it up to a reasonable age, and some never stop. The general description of Genesis 2:15 should sound very familiar to any parent. It says, "You can be free to do whatever you want in the boundaries of the world I created for you. However, be aware that crossing the line is forbidden and will have tremendous consequences. I do not find anything unique or special in this action. After all, the role of a parent in the early stages of any kid's development is to create a safe environment for a kid, define clear boundaries, and punish in case of violation." The story of Adam and Eve can be seen as a tale for parents, a story about education and the consequences of its failure. As we will progress with the story, this theory will become clear. The first and most significant problem with kids' education is the creation of trust, the capacity to maintain it, and the difficulty of evolving with it over time. In Genesis chapter 2, God says, "For in the day that you eat from it, you shall die." This threat requires a pause. This threat is the essence of all the problems that will follow. As the story goes, Adam and Eve finish by eating from the tree and do not die. I believe any adult reading the story will raise an eyebrow at this point. After all, the threat was very clear and very extreme. I call it an asymmetric, losing lie. These kinds of lies told by parents are common in different variations and on different scales of extremity. Many parents will exaggerate in the description of the dangers in this world. It is made out of a wish to protect our children. Regardless, such a lie puts one in a predicament. Any test of this threat will immediately be discovered as the theoretical consequences are so extreme. Practically, the discovery of the lie by the child cannot in any way bring a positive outcome. It makes the threat giver a liar, breaking the trust between the child and the parent, rendering any future threat less reliable. Why should an existence as God put himself in such a place? I came to believe that it is done for two different reasons. The first concerns the idea that stories exist to reflect the reality we all live in. As such, it describes not the behavior of an all-capable God, but the human behavior of any parent. Secondly, it seems to me that it is done to prepare us for the development of the real lessons of the story, one that has to do with disappointment, independence, and ownership of one's own mistakes and consequences. God went as far as to claim death while he could just claim punishment. Another way to approach this matter can be to see it as a metaphor. In this case, the death in question reflects the death of a reality and hierarchical structure, which can refer to the death of trust and/or dependency. Since eating from the tree of good and bad reflects a development in a child's inner world, the consequences of eating from the tree will inevitably bring to the death of a certain reality and a permanent change in the parent-child relationship. The story continues by describing the natural development of any kid. As children develop, they start to understand the world around them and start naming it. Naming the world around us is a very important point, sometimes missed by many readers. In the first chapter of Genesis, God calls things into being, as in, God said, "Let it be light." God uses the word for the creation process, while Adam calls the world around him. I find this distinction extremely important, as it seems that the general approach to words in our current society has taken a wrong turn. As I wrote in a different section, the first part of the story of Genesis can be seen as the creation of the inner cosmos of each one of us. In the world that exists only in our head, we create action out of the word's usage. A simple example can be the placebo effect. In general, our inner worlds of thoughts and feelings are made of our subjective experiences. The subjective experience is highly affected by how we decide to interpret it, which is done by naming a specific experience, making the word the master of our inner world. On the other side, the external world is also partly subjective. Solid, liquid, cold, and heavy are only part of the objective aspect of the outside world. There is a limitation to how much one can change the external fabric of reality by wishing it to be different. A solid wall will stand firm regardless of how much a person will scream at it that it should be soft. The fact that the story of Adam and Eve starts by pointing out that Adam is naming the world around him seems to me highly meaningful. It establishes objectivism's existence and defines language's role in human existence. Based on this interpretation, in the human experience, words are used to describe and not dictate the reality around us. This fundamental truth that has been forgotten brings a lot of misery and pain to many people in our current age. Moving on, regardless of all the abundance Adam has, he still feels lonely. A helper and partner are missing. Interestingly, when introducing all the living things to Adam, one of God's purposes is to make Adam find a partner and a helper. By itself, we can conclude that humans need a worldly partner. God, representing the parent that wishes only the best for his child, knows that loneliness is not an option for humans. Regardless of the diversity of animals around Adam, he still fails to find a match. forcing God to create a second existence that is similar but still different. The time given in Genesis to describe this process is very relevant. It comes to show that humans are social. Moreover, it establishes that humans are not social by choice, but out of an inner necessity. I do not believe in the importance of the order of creation between man and woman. From a human standpoint, we all know that two variations exist, male and female. I believe the story was written by a man in a man-dominant period, bringing the first character to be Adam and not Eve. By itself, it doesn't show any superiority. It simply implies that in the process of telling a story, one differentiates between who he is and the other sex in front of him. At this point, I believe the importance of the distinction is that we are not good alone. We all need someone similar to us, but still a bit different as a partner. To make this point even stronger, we can look at the text. Adam says, "This, at last, is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken." Some will see it as a confirmation of man's superiority, an idea I find incredibly superfluous. In the way I see it, the sentence hides a few elements. The first is admitting and recognizing that man and woman are created from the same essence. It shows the equality in the process of creation. At last, represent a feeling of relief, proving the need and uneasiness of loneliness. Naming the new encounter woman is just a natural process. Adam perceives the world from his own perspective, and it's been a moment he has been naming stuff around. Adam is defined as a man, so naturally he will define his new encounter as a woman. In Hebrew, the woman is called Isha, the feminine version of the man Ish. The following line indeed establishes a hierarchy between man and woman by calling them husband and wife. The Hebrew word for wife translates to his wife, while husband translates to owner. Regardless, I came to believe this is done due to historical and social structures and not due to a specific lesson written for us in Genesis. The last part of the second chapter is strangely presented to us as the story's moral. It describes, as if for little children, from a perspective of an adult who reads the story and takes a moment to stop and ensure the message has been understood. I find this passage very interesting, as I believe it is there for two reasons. The first is to present us with a universal truth. As humans reach adulthood, they leave their parents' care and create their own circle. It says, "Therefore, a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." On the other side, looking at the story as a whole brings me to believe this passage is there as a preparation for the inevitability of the events to come. The chapter finishes there, separating two different parts of the story. The first part seems to describe a safe world, one that is controlled and supervised by a parenting figure, a safe world of discovery and guidance. It seems the story, up until this point, mainly describes an infant's development in his early childhood years. The relationship between Adam, Eve, and God is all very hierarchical and dependent. The story mainly describes the discovery of the world and the place of man in it. As we will see, the second part of the story is an entirely different story. It seems a certain jump in time exists between the two chapters. The way in which it is described makes us feel as if some time has passed in which Adam and Eve lived happily and peacefully in the garden. As the third chapter starts, we can recognize a new angle or perspective to the story. The second chapter of Genesis can be seen as a story told from the perspective of God, or alternatively, an observer telling a story describing the actions of God. As we noticed previously, the first chapter seems to be an independent story, describing the creation from God's point of view. It includes God's feelings and thoughts. The second chapter seems to be written as a play script, mainly describing actions and events happening on the stage. It can be seen as a scene that prepares us for the real story, happening only a chapter later. The story starts immediately with a dialogue between the snake and Eve, who, up to this point, is described as a woman and not named Eve. The Hebrew version of the Bible describes the snake as aram, meaning naked or cunning, while the English version uses the word crafty. The difference in terms is interesting, as one has a direct negative interpretation, while the latter does not imply it in such a strong way. As Adam and Eve were the only two humans in the garden, the snake can be seen as a representation of a third-party friend. After all, it is natural that with time, one will start a conversation with other people. This step in the evolution of children is familiar to all of us. After several years in which a kid grows up in the closed world of his parents' house, he becomes social. As part of their development, kids begin to look for other kids to play with and learn from after reaching a certain age. I find it unsurprising that we call the first place we send our kids to a kindergarten, as it translates to the garden for kids. There, and throughout all their educational years, the weight of the parent diminishes, and kids grow to be independent. Unsurprisingly, it is at this stage that the natural discovery of all the asymmetric lies described previously will happen, creating the painful process of separation between the kid and its parent. The description of the conversation with the snake seems to me relatively common for kids in the early stages of school. The general scenario in which one kid repeats to another a terrible prohibition imposed on him by his parent is typical. As all kids grow up with different educational beliefs, it is just a matter of time before one of the prohibitions and its consequences will be contradicted by another kid. Eventually, the snake and Eve's conversation is nothing more than a kid saying, "My parents told me," and the other kid responding, "It is not true. Look." This is one of the issues with the asymmetric lie. It just requires various encounters with reality to be naturally discovered. Seeing another kid do what you thought was impossible can be described as the first inevitable step toward eating the forbidden fruit. This explains why censorship is needed in many social structures built on asymmetric lies. To make this point even more relevant, we all know the feeling one gets when listening to someone contradicting his own core belief. Generally, when opinions are based on conformity and not knowledge, it is harder for a person to hear an opinion that contradicts his opinion. In most cases, this difficulty arises due to the reliance on asymmetric lies, and, in a more profound sense, we all know it. As we grow, we find comfort in this kind of lies, as we prefer to live in a blissful ignorance than in the harsh truth. Some call it romanticism, while others call it a blissful lie. As an adult, the decision to live in such a way is personal. Kids react to asymmetric lies differently. First, because it shakes the foundation of what they call reality, and second, because it has been imposed on them externally. Let's go back to the story. I believe the conversation with the snake represents an inevitable encounter of each child with the society around him. This encounter will always have the same outcome: the enlargement of the inner world of a kid. This process takes time, and as we will see, it finishes with the complete reshaping of the relationship between a person and his creator. As I will explain in later pages, there are many ways to approach this process from the parent's point of view. It seems to me that the outcome of the process, and the main lesson of this story, has to do with how we handle it, and not our wish to stop it. So the serpent says, "You can." Eve says, "No, you cannot. My parents told me." The serpent responds, "Look, I can, so you can," bringing disturbed Eve to a position where she has no other choice but to try herself. Discovering she is still alive, she runs to the first and only person she knows to share with him the unbelievable world-shattering experience she just had. It is written in Genesis 3:6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. The text refers to the process as if Eve has seen someone trying it out before giving it a shot herself. It is clearly written as an aftermath of observation. Already at this point in the text, it can be understood that the first step into the world of knowledge was the understanding itself, even before trying the fruit. It is interesting to take the time and reflect upon it, as wisdom and creation start from thought. Any wisdom requires a circle that includes doubt, experience, and realignment following the outcome. In the text, it seems it is mentioned that only watching the effect of one eating the fruit without dying is part of the process of becoming wise. Many interpretations of the text, including Judaism and Christianity, put some guilt on the snake or on Eve for the misery of Adam. This is quite surprising when looking at it from the perspective described above. First, if the snake has eaten from the tree and survived, it is natural that he will share it with Eve. Moreover, if we assume the mental stage of both as children, it is inevitable that such a conversation will arise. Second, I find it hard to see how Eve could have responded differently to the snake. After all, the evidence was there. The fact that Eve gave some to Adam to try it out himself is a natural reaction, which I'm certain would have happened if Adam was the first to go. As we will see later, the guilt approach taken by many religions seems to be a process of reverse engineering the story. Curiosity is a natural human trait, and guilt is in no way mentioned in this part of the text. Curiosity should be part of the story if the story is indeed a tale for both parents and children. This human trait is one of the most positive aspects of humans, and it is what brought us to the wonderful world of progress we live in today. Curiosity pushed us to create, explore, and evolve. The later philosophy dictating that curiosity is negative came from the incapacity of religion to answer complex questions or from the fear of ignorance in front of people that have the strength to ask. It can be understood how some boundaries on curiosity are needed for children due to the hidden risks of curiosity. Nevertheless, as I will show later on, I don't think it is the point of the story. God, that created man, knew the nature of man. Curiosity couldn't be missed either by God as an all-capable existence or by God as a representation of a parent. Blaming a person for being a person does not teach us anything, nor present the authoritative figure as reasonable. Based on this logic, I came to the conclusion that all the guilt attributed to Adam, Eve, or the snake is just a backward interpretation created by later generations based on the necessities of their time. The aftermath of eating the fruit is described as an eye-opening experience that makes both Adam and Eve understand they were naked. While it can be taken to the word, I doubt it will be sufficient. The eye-opening and the nakedness metaphor can refer to a change in how they perceive the world around them and/or how they see themselves, and I have no doubt in my mind that it probably refers to both. As we discussed it, there is a hidden element in this sentence, familiar to all parents. When a kid realizes how wrong he was about the world and a moment of distrust arises for the first time, a general feeling of terror and alienation is created in the kid's head. In many cases, the natural reaction of the kid will be to hide the experience from his parents and try to avoid them or the subject in general. It can be said that the experience stripped the kid from his naivety, leaving him standing naked in front of an unknown reality. Exactly as in real life, the kids in question will adapt and react to this new realization, creating a new set of beliefs to fend away from the confusion they just passed through. In the story, Adam and Eve make clothes for themselves, and like any other kid, when hearing the parent approaching, Adam and Eve hide. There is nothing unusual about it. I experienced it several times as a kid and as a parent. On any level, I do not believe that one of the morals the story is trying to give us is that knowledge is harmful. It will be absurd to assume it. After all, knowledge is the basis of the creation of language and one of the unique traits of a human. It is what separates us from the rest of the animals. Many philosophers have seen knowledge as the ultimate good. Plato's Republic is written to prove this point in the first logical structure known to the Western world. Aristotle, who dedicated his life to philosophy, wrote many pages about the superiority of wisdom and knowledge. In his book, Nicomachean Ethics, he writes, "It is not insofar as he is man that he will live a life of contemplation, but insofar as something divine is present in him. If intellect is divine, then in comparison with man, the life according to it is divine in comparison with human life. But we must not follow those who advise us, being men, to think of human things, and being mortal, of mortal things, but must, so far as we can, make ourselves immortal, and strain every nerve to live in accordance with the best thing in us. For even if it be small in bulk, much more does it in power and worth surpass everything. I firmly believe that becoming knowledgeable in one way or another is part of each person's personal development. If it is true, the usage of knowledge in the story represents an unstoppable phase. At the same time, the real lesson to be made is related to the relationship between parent and their children and the reaction to a crisis. Now we finally arrive at the story's interesting and most relevant part. God is coming back home, calling for his kids when entering the door. Adam and Eve, as two young, educated, and honest kids, respond regardless of the fact they decide to hide. God, noticing that something happened, asks for an explanation. After hearing the honest answer of his children, I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. God answers like a patient parent asking the necessary rhetorical question, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat from?" The role of the question cannot be other than a rhetorical one, as only by eating from the tree could they understand they are naked. It is fair to assume that the tone of God wasn't neutral, or that Adam didn't hear it in a neutral way, as he knew he violated God's word, though he ate from the tree and didn't die. Confronting God at this point has a double meaning. The first has to do with him disobeying in the first place, which can be seen as problematic but not by itself a reason to hide. The second, and the most problematic one, is that by standing in front of God alive after eating from the tree, he by his own existence makes God a liar. This situation is many times misunderstood by parents. We believe that the only reason a kid who disobeys a parent will feel bad is due to his disobedience, a situation that can exist in case of a violent parental reaction. In case the parent is not violent, we don't have any evidence in our story, disobedience by itself could be resolved by admitting and apologizing. We often fail to understand that the asymmetric lie made by the parent is the real problem, and it is binding. Once the truth has been discovered, the kid is standing in an impossible cognitive dissonance. Reality has shown him the truth, which he experiences on his own skin. This leaves him with two options: accept the reality and admit his parent is a liar, or ignore the reality and stick in the forced delusion of his parent. By confronting God, Adam chooses the first. When asked, "How come you are aware? Did you eat from the tree?" there is no reason to believe that Adam didn't hear a variation of, "How come you are still alive?" Knowing all this brings us to understand the complicated place Adam is at. At this point of the conflict, Adam has little choices in front of his parent. One is to honestly lash at his parent, calling him a liar, probably with some tears involved, asking for an explanation and hoping for a supportive answer, or ignoring the fact that his parent is a liar, putting the responsibility of the matter on someone else. He obviously takes full responsibility for his own actions, stands straight and says, "Yes, I did, and it was great," and waits for punishment. In reality, most of the kids will not react in this way, as the dissonance in their heads does not allow them to. After all, Adam saw in his own eye Eve and the snake eating from the fruit and not dying, and moreover, looking pretty happy and excited. In Adam's eyes, there was no reason in the world not to try it too. As a parent, I learned that any situation is an excellent opportunity to teach my kids something new or reinforce a lesson, which doesn't mean in any way that every case is a lesson by itself. As an educative person, I believe fear shouldn't be part of any kid's experience. It is harder to live by than to say, but parenting is not easy to start with. Back to the impossible situation Adam is in. As accusing God of being a liar is unthinkable, Adam chooses to shift the blame. As many kids do, he puts it all on Eve. Doing so is not lying in any way. After all, it is a very accurate account of what happened. By doing so, Adam admits he ate from the tree and pushes the responsibility of his action toward Eve. When asked, Eve, from her side, does the same and blames the snake. And the snake, well, he never got the privilege to defend himself. At this point, God lashes out. He is furious, reacting like a dictator losing his power or a person pushed into a corner close to his death. He punishes the snake brutally, but for some strange reason keeping him alive. Can God not kill in the garden? Curses Adam and Eve and kicks them out of his home, never to be seen again. He condemns his loved creation to what he describes as a life of misery, creating what we call today life. An interesting paragraph is 322. See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now he might reach out his hand and also take from the tree of life, and eat and live forever. This paragraph reveals to us several things. 1. God knew that no death would arrive from eating the fruit. 2. That knowledge is positive, as it makes man reach the point of godhood. 3. It is not Adam and Eve's actions that got them kicked out, but the fear of the future actions that they could take. Since trust has been broken between both sides bilaterally, it is easy to understand why it is possible that such events could happen. By all accounts, it seems God's reaction was as extreme as it could get. If he decided to kill Adam and Eve, the only extremer reaction, no one would stay behind to tell the story. God punished Adam and Eve more severely than the snake as he stayed in the garden while Adam and Eve were banished. No other dialogue exists, and no place for argument or redemption has been allowed. The end. Adam and Eve can be seen as a tragic story of failed parenthood. It presents us with the worst-case scenario, one in which everything goes wrong, from the child's behavior to his parents' reaction. Like a good tragedy, it exists to teach us a lesson, one that is important and universal, lessons that have to do with human nature. Like many ancient stories, this one is a tragic drama that comes to show and teach us important lessons by presenting to us the worst possible scenario and outcome. In the ancient sense, tragedy exists to teach us how to do better if we only find the power inside of ourselves. I believe that there are many lessons in this story. Some are there in the open, and some are hidden and require reflection. To start to comprehend it all, we will need a framework, one that will allow us, after a long reflection. It seems to me that the story of Adam and Eve is told as a tale between a kid growing up and his parents. The story takes us through all the evolutionary stages of a kid's life. It starts with describing a safe and controlled space, one that does not know concern or fear, a state of dependence, obedience, and naivety. The story takes us through the stages of discovery, doubt, and the development of independent thinking, and finishes with the separation between the adult child and his parents. One of the supporting pieces of evidence to the idea that the story is a tragedy in the old sense of the word is the inevitable process and its end. Moreover, as I mentioned above, the end of the second chapter in Genesis tells us this is the way of life. In Genesis 2:24, the chapter finishes with the following sentence: "Therefore, a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." It is as if the writer is preparing us by framing the story in a certain way. The lessons that can be learned from the story have to do with the creation of what I call an asymmetric negative lie. The missed opportunity to constructively educate a kid in a crucial moment of his evolution, and the incapability of a parent to accept and support the idea that his own kid is becoming equal or even better than himself. We will analyze each of them separately, and then reach some general conclusions. The asymmetric negative lie is a common behavior in parenthood. Forbidding an act from kids and attaching it to a catastrophic event should be familiar to any human being. It can come in the form of, "Don't do that, you will fall," to, "If you don't do that, your future is doomed." Many variations exist, and in many cases, the origin of those sentences comes from a wish to protect our children. Other times, it comes from a lazy way of creating obedience. Regardless of the reasons for it, this technique of education is probably the worst way to go about it. I call it an asymmetric negative lie because the gains are always small and temporary while the downside is promised, bringing highly negative effects. I will say again that the perspective applied to the text has to do with creating a healthy, long-lived relationship between a parent and his child. If this is what we aim for, using an asymmetric negative lie as a way to educate one's kid is extremely unfavorable. These kinds of lies are bound to be discovered, exactly as we saw in our story. It can take seconds, days, or years, but it gets found by the kid in one way or another. Since the essence of the lie is based, maintained, and demand the creation of compliance, regardless of its probability or logic, time is all that is needed for it to be discovered as false. Now, I don't claim for a moment that boundaries shouldn't be set on kids. Oppositely, I know they are important and find them crucial. The issue is not about if, but how. Any relationship is built on a certain level of trust, which is especially important in a relationship between a kid and his parents. The model of trust a kid internalizes and brings with him forward is based on his relationship with his parent. Creating correct. Expectations and trust between a parent and his kid can be seen as the first and most important guideline for any educational relationship. An asymmetric negative lie is doomed to break this trust and put kids in a very peculiar place. I find the use of such lies to come mainly from laziness from the parents' side. Laziness that sometimes comes from not putting in the right amount of attention and sometimes from exhaustion. Every asymmetric negative lie can be framed differently and can be explained in a way that will not undermine the authority of the parents. As an example, sentences such as, "Don't do this," it can be very dangerous. Or, "If you decide to do this, be aware of," or, "Don't do this, I really don't like it." Any other method is better than an asymmetric negative lie, as trust that has been broken can never be fully restored. Moving forward in the story, the inevitable happened. The kids, going out into the world and talking with other kids around, discover the lie. The lie doesn't concern the fact that some actions have their consequences, but with the consequences themselves. In our story, God could have said, "Don't eat from the tree. If you do, you will anger me," or "You will have to bear heavy consequences." As he decides to frame it with the punishment of death, it only requires an external experience, proving otherwise to awaken the curiosity and impulse of the kids to try it out. It seems natural and predictable that any kid will react in this way. Adding to it the importance and weight of participating in activities with other kids, it is hard to believe the event could ever turn differently. Part of the natural and healthy process of growing up is to try, taste, and discover the world around us. Preventing this process reflects the parent's fear and incapability to give his kids the tools needed to grow and not the kid's bad nature. Let us pass on to the second lesson of the story, the missed opportunity to educate constructively at a crucial moment in any kid's evolution. After eating from the tree and confessing the act, any parent finds himself in a peculiar place. As I mentioned, the kid in question is in quite a predicament, and trust has been broken, and the kid lives a cognitive dissonance. His options are to call the father a liar, shifting the responsibility of his natural behavior to himself or a third person. Explaining to one parent that he is a liar, hopefully done in an emotional way, requires the kid to have a lot of maturity and trust in the constructive reaction of the parent. Since trust has just been broken, the kid is standing in front of an unknown. This situation is not realistic in the majority of cases. In any case, this reaction could be seen on the part of the parent as a direct accusation and attack on his role, which could bring the same devastating reaction as we saw in our story. The second option of taking full responsibility for his own action, shifting all the burden on oneself, is probably the most mature and desirable outcome. In such a case, any reaction from the side of the parent, which is not supportive, will represent the superiority of the kid over his parent. Since this scenario is very unlikely, we will not analyze it further. The third scenario is to shift the blame to an external third party. This approach can be seen as logical. It allows the kid not to handle with the real problem, not lie about the events that caused him to defy his parents' order and diminish his responsibility in the matter. It is important to remember that the issue at hand is very complicated. From the kid's perspective, from a self-concentrated perspective of a kid, his actions are justified on many levels, and the problem arises not from the act, but from the dissonance that has been created from the parent side. As with any other crisis, this predicament is an excellent opportunity. It requires the parent to show patience, understanding, compassion, and maturity. This inevitable step symbolizes the creation of independent thinking and opens the door to a few important lessons. As it is a trust crisis, both from the parent and the kid side, an important opportunity has been created. One that can reinforce the bond between the sides and pave a new way of communication. To allow the healthy development of any kid, a step has to be taken toward independence, autonomic judgment, responsibility, and honesty. This crisis is by itself a crucial event in the development of the kid. Its resolution will create a framework for his future relationship with the world, himself, and his parent. Since our story is a tragedy, it presents us with the worst possible reaction. Lashing out and punishing severely do not help any of the people involved. There is nothing educational about this kind of action. Moreover, it will most probably damage the relationship between the sides, leaving the kid's inner conflict unresolved and not teaching the kid anything positive or constructive. Such a traumatic experience will create precedents in any child's mind, developing anger, mistrust, and violence toward himself, his parent, and the world around him. A different approach to such a situation will require first a high level of awareness from the parent. Being aware of the mentality of the person in front of you requires a lot of empathy, calm, and consciousness. While it is a lot to ask, if the parent will not take this approach, it is hard to expect any kid to develop it later on by himself. Since the crisis is a general trust crisis, a positive approach can be to sit with the kid and ask him more about the event. Understand how he felt and what the consequences were in his inner world. Recognize the mistake of applying the asymmetric lie and create a healthy dialogue. If addressed correctly, this crisis can be used to teach responsibility, rebuild a system of trust, and develop better tools to handle future events. The change in the trust system between the kid and his parents is fundamental. For the benefit and healthy development of the kid, trust should shift from blind trust into constructive trust. Up to a certain point, blind trust is the only way a kid perceives the world. It is inevitable as the life experience is limited and created by the limitation created in the safe world built by the parents. Growing up and going into the world, the kid does not need an educative figure to limit his growth. He desperately needs a guide. I came to believe that part of the reason today's youth do not see a source of guidance in the older generation comes from the parents' failure to react correctly to this crisis. The recreation of trust is a crucial step in the healthy development of all relationships and any kid's development. While I recommend, above all, a patient and compassionate response from the parent side, we cannot ignore the fact that trust has been broken from the parent side as well. This event creates an excellent opportunity for teaching the concept of responsibility and consequences. There is no doubt that punishment needs to be given. Building trust and creating a healthy base for future communication don't contradict the necessity for punishment. Learning the importance of consequences and responsibility for one's own action is an important lesson as any other. It is part of adult life and the first step into the world of a healthy adult. For a kid that knows that something went wrong, the fact that punishment will follow is acceptable. Looking at it from an educational perspective, the question regarding the punishment has more to do with the explanation, the way it has been framed, and the story's moral. In this case, a moderate punishment needs to be given with a calm and firm explanation. Doing so will create healthy precedents for creating a framework of fairness and allow the kid to understand responsibility and consequences. Finally, explaining to the kid how he should react if such a crisis repeats itself, which will most definitely happen, is important. Creating a more mature relationship and establishing expectations forward. Concluding from this story that becoming independent and taking responsibility for one's life is, at its core, an act given to us as a punishment by God for our sins, always left me perplexed. Hardness is part of life, and it is also what creates our life satisfaction, self-fulfillment, and greatness. Without challenges and achievement, life has very little meaning or fun. It is not the easy part that we remember, but the one that took from us and gave us back. Having children is one of the most complicated challenges in any person's life, but one of the most rewarding things a person can have. Working hard and getting where you aim to be is satisfying and feeling your inner life. I always found it strange to see life as a place that starts from misery. As a parent, growing up with your kid and developing a long-term and healthy relationship with him is one of the most fulfilling things a person can have. As a parent, we are responsible for guiding our kids and giving them the trusting space to express and try while maintaining a frame that allows us to enjoy them. The punishments given to Adam and Eve are the most severe type. They are permanent and bring suffering and humiliation. As we are handling with a tragic story, it is not surprising to learn that this is the reaction of God in the story. An interesting observation is related to the fact that the punishment does not include the banishment from the garden, as it is not included in the punishment description at this point. To be exact, the banishment from the garden is included a paragraph later, following a new line of logic. The way the Bible describes the punishment and the order in which the logic is built bring us to our last lesson. One that has to do with the incapability of a parent to accept and support the idea that his own kid is becoming equal or even better than himself. This lesson has to do with the inner limitation of the parent himself. This aspect of the story can be related to parents who wishes their kid to be something, forcing his wish regardless of their kid's capacities and inclination. Or it can be related to the ego of a parent refusing to accept his kid has grown into an independent adult that is different, equal, and sometimes better than himself. In Genesis 3:22-23 it is written, "Then the Lord God said, 'See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now he might reach out his hand and also take from the tree of life and eat and live forever.'" 23. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. It can be understood that the reason for sending Adam and Eve out of the garden and closing its doors isn't because of the act of eating from the tree by itself. It seems as if the realization of equality and the fear of some future events brought God to this final act. The final step in becoming an independent adult is to leave your parents' home, which is a natural step, solidifying a child's independence. As I mentioned previously, Genesis 2:24 states it as an inevitable reality by writing, "Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." The crucial part and the lesson in the story are not related to the act of separation between one from his parents' home, but to how it is done and its implications for the rest of the life of the people involved. I believe this final part is a call for self-reflection. It is not related to any specific event. It is mentioned in the text to show us how we are the worst obstacle in creating and developing our relationship with our kids. Our ego and fear are the most challenging aspect of our own lives, and it prevents us from being the best version of ourselves and leads us to misery. Many relationships between parents and their kids evolve to be a point of pain and not joy. Admitting and accepting that a kid has grown to become what he is, regardless of our wishes and efforts, is complicated. Letting one kid go is not simple. Allowing a kid to be more than what we ever managed to be can be painful. Regardless of all the difficulties, it is in the parent's power to accept, support, and forgive. It is a step that only a parent can take. It is the curse and the privilege of parenthood. As unperfect beings, we can aspire towards something, accepting the downfall on the way. Educating a kid is first accepting yourself and recognizing your fear, preventing negative aspects from passing to the next generation. The last part of the story presents us as part of the tragedy, the worst outcome a parent can choose. Closing the door to one child is the final act of detachment, one that leaves us alone, angry, and frustrated. As we will see in the following story, family is the basis for the creation of a tribe and a society. Creating problematic relationships in the family affects how we see and interact with the world. As parents, it is our job to give our children the best tools possible. It is the parent's responsibility to overcome his own anger, fear, and ego, promising the best relationship possible between the parent and their children. Life is hard. As parents, we have the power to make the process harder than it should be. Our job is to guide our kids to be as prepared as possible. It requires patience, forgiveness, humility, and determination. If there is one conclusion that I hope you took from this story, is this: life and parenting are not about what or how many mistakes you make. It is all about how you frame the world with your child and handle the complications on the way. I assure you many complications will come, and you will make many mistakes. You, as a parent, are the best or worst thing that can happen to your kids. It is your choice which one you wish to be, not by always being right and strong, but by knowing how to be empathetic, guiding, loving, and forgiving. Allow your child to be the best version of himself, not the version you decide he should be. The story of Adam and Eve presents us with some important lessons about parenthood. It reflects a natural process any parent will pass with his children. I have no doubt in my mind that this process is universal and can be applied to all humans regardless of time, culture, sex, or origin. Understanding and passing these lessons can ameliorate our society and facilitate part of the complicated task of parenthood.